Box made a very quintessential liberal Zionist sort of video on apartheid, though most of the video was actually made by someone else. He found a Palestinian creator, got them to do the vast majority of the video that actually took effort, being the part that involves a lot of visual effort with the drawings, and the part that involves a lot of research effort with the actual very sort of dry descriptions of apartheid in Israel. Though this isn't exactly a very controversial thing to include in your video these days, considering even lots of liberal Zionists are openly calling it apartheid these days, and even if they're not specifically using the word, they still are at least capable of accurately describing like the systems in place without going as far as actually going to the roots of the problem, being colonialism, of course. So the brunt of the video, the part that actually took a lot of effort, was made by someone else. He brings on a Palestinian to sort of tokenize them, to be like, look, a Palestinian agrees with me, and he lets the Palestinian sort of take control of the dry description part, while he takes control of the more sort of vibey, feely, well, now what do we do part that doesn't really involve much research or forming a coherent argument as the other part did. So I'm going to skip the apartheid part. I would hope that most of the people watching this are already well informed on that. Apartheid is not exactly a very controversial thing anymore. As I said, the Amnesty International report on it is fairly good. The work on it has been done for years and years and years by many, many organizations, many of them not even particularly radical organizations, and doesn't really need reiterating. At this point, it's just fairly uncontroversial. So we get to Box's part after almost 40 minutes. He comes on the screen, he butts in after he lets a Palestinian speak
I'm consuming.
Sort of propose where we should go on their behalf. I could have done something like this a million times over. I have many dozens of Palestinians in my audience, most of whom are actually living in Palestine. Personally, I don't really think it's particularly good form to bring on someone basically just to do a lot of work for you and state your own opinions, right? Because I'm sure Box agrees with everything that he said. Probably if he was capable of putting in the effort to do some real research, he would have said something very similar. So it's essentially just a way to sort of legitimize your own opinions by bringing on someone who has the right identity category. I'm not very big on that, though I could very easily do it. I have my weaponized Palestinian Salim in my pocket all the time. So let's get to Box's part and take a look at it, see what he advocates for. And this is a particularly interesting thing because he actually took up a lot of my positions that he was arguing against 2 months ago, which I think pretty clearly indicates what I was saying, in that he adopted his position in the moment just for the sake of arguing against me. I seriously doubt that he had really given them much thought beforehand because, he clearly hadn't really heard of what I was saying very much because he was coming up with random, whatever intuitive thoughts he had on the spot in order to sort of argue against them, while in this video he's actually sort of suddenly arguing for a lot of them. So let's take a look at that.
Okay. So now that we've gone through all that, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, what can I do about that? And at first glance, it looks like a really difficult question to answer.
Asking questions like on an individual level, I might just be nitpicking, but what can I do about that? As an individual, you can't do shit.
I'm consuming.
Okay? As an individual, what you can do is become a part of a group, become a part of an organization. You can't do shit by yourself. Already not a big fan of that sort of framing, but it could just be a fairly imprecise writing, which I do a lot sometimes as well.
Grown fairly accustomed to disappointment from their domestic and international partners. From their history of being frequently let down by allies in the surrounding Arab countries, the corrupt multimillionaires leading Fatah in the West Bank, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the fruitless and destructive partisanship between...
Yeah, you'll notice here, now it is absolutely true that a lot of Palestinian groups are absolutely not really on the side of the Palestinians. You talk to most Palestinians, especially those from the West Bank, they're not exactly huge fans of Fatah. They're not exactly huge fans of the so-called Palestinian Authority. As for Hamas letting down Palestinians, Hamas are actually very popular, and it's much better to interrogate why that is than to just blanket say Palestinians don't like them as if that's the opinion of Palestinians, when, there's many indications that it's not.
Their own political leaders, their list of friends has always been fairly slim. One of the things that makes the apartheid comparison so important is that it emphasizes the role of other countries around the world. Israel owes its dominance to the support it receives from the international community, and Palestinian failure is largely owed to a lack thereof. Just as it was in South Africa, the attitudes of our own governments are crucial to what happens over there. Going with the fact that most of you are probably from somewhere in Europe or North America, we should talk about the kind of things that can be done in our own countries. Because based
He says this, and then he goes on to essentially prescribe everything that he argued against when I talked to him. And I find this very, very funny. He scoffed here. I'll bring up the so-called debate that we had so that we can take a look at it. And I will specifically cite the points where he very clearly had the complete opposite positions to what he is now saying. There was specifically a point in this where I said, there's a reason why you are important. There's a reason why people from these countries that he's talking about are important, because they're from the countries with the most global economic power, and therefore the most ability to put pressure on Israel, and therefore their activism is specifically important, which he, of course, scoffed at. So let's wait for him to mention some more specifics, and then we'll go into that.
on my own limited experience, activism in Western countries really isn't as difficult as you might think. The first step is to know what you're advocating for. In recent years, support for the famous two-state solution of sovereign nations based on the 1967 borders has become increasingly unpopular, with many arguing that the expansion of settlements in the West Bank.
You will note that he's not going to interrogate colonialism or anything like that, really. It's rather, the two-state solution isn't fundamentally unjust per se, even despite the fact that even if you for some reason accept the Israeli Declaration of Independence as valid or the UN vote on the regard valid, it's the 1967 borders, which were obviously solidified following a war,
has made it impossible. Last month, a poll came out showing that opposition to the two-state solution has now grown to an all-time high of 69%. At the same time...
Where, though? I assume that was in Palestine, which is the only place that matters. You just didn't mention
9%.
it.
At the same time, support for the one-state solution with equal rights for Jews and Palestinians has been surging in the past year. However, the numbers here have also been inconsistent, with neither option seeming to establish a clear majority. And then there's the question of what exactly a one-state solution...
The thing is, when you add up, I'm not sure if he's citing the poll here, but when you add up the support among Palestinians for either type of one state, like one state with equal rights for both, or one state basically with like Palestinian supremacy or something, which is obviously not what we want, but you can't really blame some Palestinians for thinking that, considering what has been done to them. These are the sorts of attitudes that need to be worked on, especially in Israel, because obviously they're the aggressor in this case. But there are Palestinians who have that sort of attitude as well, and I'm pretty, it's obviously going to dissipate when they stop being oppressed by Israelis. It's kind of difficult to like live under incredible oppression and have someone ask you, would you be happy to live alongside the people who have been oppressing you for decades upon decades, and have them answer yes to that. If you see this question here, this question is specifically about one state, equal rights, just essentially
rights, of course,
merging the two countries as they exist now. So it doesn't seem to address those two together. If you do add them together as just like a blanket one state solution of some description, the support is overwhelming.
Neither option seeming to establish a clear majority. And then there's the question of what exactly a one-state solution means. Whether it means a binational state for Jews and Arabs, a Palestinian-Israeli confederation. These are all interesting questions.
Binational and confederation basically mean the same thing, by the way. Binational usually is taken to mean like Palestine, Israel. They're part of one state, but they're two separate autonomous regions within it.
But for most of us,
And that's not what we want, probably,
really think this is the best thing to focus on. As advocates from the other side of the world, there isn't much use in picking teams from a group of people that doesn't really seem to agree on much at all.
What?
Especially when their rights are being violated in ways that most international bodies would agree is unacceptable. Or, as the campaigner and NGO founder Jamal Juma put it was impossible for the movement to adopt in its discourse a political solution based on the two-state or the one-state solution because the Palestinian people do not agree on either of them.
They do now. I mean, if you ask Palestinians about do they want all of Palestine or do they want a tiny little concentration camp enclave in the West Bank and Gaza, they'll tell you the first one. It's just a matter of framing. It's a matter of phrasing. See, the problem is that we understand one state versus two state in terms of the way that these are talked about internationally. But we don't really talk about them on the terms that Palestinians themselves would like to, or what they mean when they think about these things. Rather, we talk about them as like some sort of incredibly disconnected, sort of non-colonial, nothing like that. It's just a matter of everyone somehow getting along and creating one state without any sort of material justice to remedy colonialism, nothing like that. And another, it's two state that is essentially based on Israeli terms, which would be essentially a massive surrender, right? It would be peace on Israeli terms, as Noam Chomsky once put something similar. It wouldn't actually be anything resembling just. Obviously, the separation of Palestine on ethnic grounds, ceding half of it to essentially an invading settler population, is not what you want.
Palestinian issue is one of rights against the injustices and violations they are subjected to.
The Palestinian issue is one of rights, one of simple rights, one of human rights. This is in very, very liberal framing, right? The Palestinian issue is not one of a very simple material question, like land, homes being systemically stolen, given to one ethnic group who have then since exerted supremacy over another in order to maintain these material privileges. It is simply one of human rights. Give Palestinians equal rights. Do not actually change anything on the material side of things, none of that. Everything will be fixed. And, this guy is a Palestinian, no doubt. There are liberal Palestinians, believe it or not.
Realizing absolute justice for our people, given the context of the historical injustice that has befallen them, does not seem possible in the near future. Therefore, talking about one or two states becomes a political luxury and privilege in light of the great imbalance of power in favor of the colonizer that is using the most advanced modern technology to subdue, oppress, and displace the colonized. Now, that isn't to say there isn't any value in talking about one or two states, but personally, I think we can only spend so long sitting in a fog of cigar smoke discussing borders and partition plans like the English bastards who started this whole thing in the first place. Instead, I think a much more useful and simple approach.
You're Scottish. You're a part of just saying only English. The Scottish complicity in colonialism is always glossed over, just like it is there. You're the same.
Approach would just be to listen to Palestinians. Look at what their more immediate...
Precisely what he doesn't like to do. Precisely what my man here does not like to do. And you'll see what he's going to say here when he finally gets to the right of return. This is essentially just one big excuse not to actually talk about the fundamentals of the issue, because this is a discussion that needs to be had. This is a discussion that absolutely needs to be had. You can't just gloss over it and say, well, listen to Palestinians. They don't talk about these things. Yeah, they do. What are you talking about? You showed us polls that shows us that they are intimately thinking about these things all the time. And then you listen to Palestinians and you just gloss over it.
And encourage our own politicians to take note. Of course, we've already pointed out how Palestinians are far from being a monolith. Opinions and narratives will vary between people who live in Gaza.
They're not a monolith, right? So I can always find someone among them who will share my opinion and thus allow me to lend legitimacy to it. I can tell you right now, if you go up to a Palestinian and you said what this guy said to me about the right of return, I don't think that would really qualify as listening to them. I, in fact, think you would get a very negative reaction.
The West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Palestinians who live within Israel, the millions of people living as refugees stranded in Jordan or Lebanon, often only a short drive away from their old homes. But despite all of that fracturing, there is still a surprising amount of common ground. One commentator suggested that the protests which swept the entire country last year were the most uniform display of resistance since 1948. The idea of a collective Palestinian consciousness is...
You may notice, earlier he said that Palestinians hate Hamas, etc., but huge part of why this was possible is because of armed resistance, even just symbolic armed resistance. It's something that gives people hope. Palestinians considered what happened in the Gaza conflict last year, the Gaza aggression by Israel, to be a military victory. Okay, not just a symbolic one. And that's something worth talking about. Why is it that an Islamic fundamentalist group that, normally we would not be even thinking about talking about in good terms is able to rally so much support? It's because they fight. I do not think that someone like this would ever express support for armed Palestinian resistance against Israel, rather just very vibey shit.
Still very much alive, and their immediate demands have managed to stay consistent. When asked about their most vital national goals, Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank gave a pretty clear answer as to what their top priorities are. The first was ending the occupation, or in other words, the Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 borders.
Note how they don't actually use the term occupation for that question to Palestinians, but he uses the term occupation. It's true that the West Bank is occupied and obviously Gaza is under a massive blockade, but the rest of so-called Israel is also occupied.
A bit of background. The Six-Day War in 1967 ended with Israel seizing the Gaza Strip.
This is the typical sort of liberal framing that you would expect from the guy. The problem isn't Israel. It's not the formation of Israel as an ethno-nationalist entity that engaged in ethnic cleansing and then has since kept Palestinians in enclaves while slowly encroaching on as much as of their former territory as it possibly, or much more of their former territory as it possibly can. Rather, it's just an issue of Israel stepping beyond its bounds. Okay, very important sort of way that they frame this. They don't get into the nitty gritty of the origins. Honestly, this is not even really a controversial take. You will have very similar takes from this from even right-wing governments supportive of Israel around the world. This is more or less the official, like the 1967 borders is more or less the official stance of the US government, has been, aside from the Trump years, for a very long time. Certainly the stance of Biden, certainly the stance of the Labour Party in the UK, even of the Conservative Party in the UK. 1967 borders. My man here is as radical as Boris Johnson. He's as radical as David Cameron. Well, I mean, at least David Cameron had the balls to call Gaza a concentration camp. I'm not even sure if he would say that.
The West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt and the Golan Heights in Syria. Over 500,000 Arabs were displaced, and the rest were brought under Israeli control. Later that year, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 242, which called for withdrawal of Israel.
By the way, I am very much against calling Palestinians simply Arabs. That is something that Israelis do. I mean, I don't think he's doing it on purpose, but you shouldn't call Palestinians Arabs. The reason why it's Israeli Arab and not Israeli Palestinian is because Israel is founded on this sort of denial of a Palestinian identity even existing. You'll see Israelis making ridiculous arguments that like the word Palestine didn't even exist before, which is obviously bullshit, and that a Palestinian national identity isn't a thing, that Palestine was never a real country, that Palestinians aren't a people, they're just random Arabs or whatever. Don't call them Arabs. Calling them Arabs, you know, intentional or not, you're legitimizing Zionist narratives about who they are. There are not Israeli Arabs. There are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. Arabs were not expelled. Palestinians were expelled. Language is very important.
Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. They infamously omitted one very important word before the word territories, which gave Israel a good bit of room for interpretation. They withdrew from the Sinai in 1979 and, yeah. To this day, the occupying forces in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are still there. And despite pulling out of Gaza in 2005, Israel still has control over the air and maritime spaces and control over the border, which looks like this, by the way. This ongoing occupation, including the expansion of settlements into the West Bank and the denial of Palestinian self-determination, are all unambiguously illegal, and opposing them should be a no-brainer. Now, in case you noticed that second part about a Palestinian state,
yeah, it should be a no-brainer. That's why this isn't really radical at all. And I find it very interesting that, like, Lonerbox is presented and certainly presents himself as a radical sort of left-wing figure when that is about as far as he will go on this. He even acknowledges that it's really a no-brainer. I agree, it's a no-brainer. You'll even find a lot of, at least center-right people who completely agree with this, completely agree with the take regarding the 1967 borders. And that is why this confuses me, you know? If that's as far as you're willing to go, which is, by the way, far less far than most Palestinians will go, or are really willing to go, you will have some Palestinians, minority now, for example, who will be supportive of a two-state solution, but only as, for example, well, you know, we're defeated, it's the best that we can get, right? A very sad position. But aside from that position, which is essentially due to them being worn down and oppressed for decades upon decades, you're not going to find someone who will just say, on a moral grounds, on an ethical grounds, on like a just grounds, we are only entitled to being returned to the 1967 borders. You won't find it basically anyone. And I think it should be pretty simple among us that, as being people who are supposedly radical, that we should aim to you know, be alongside them on that, try to find ways to make going further than this simple, as he acknowledges, a very simple, easy, liberal, non-radical take. We should find ways to go beyond that, to get actual justice for Palestinians rather than just some sort of Northern Ireland-esque half measure, and we all know how well that went.
And they're thinking, well, isn't that kind of like a two-state solution? Well, first of all, well spotted, but also, no. Long story short, a two-state solution and two states are not quite the same thing, but that's probably for a different video. The second demand is the right of return. This one might need a bit more background. The State of Israel was born in...
This is the best part. You will see him fundamentally argue some of the exact same arguments that he argued against. Some of the arguments from here are taken directly from me, because he first heard them evidently in our discussion.
1940. during the Arab-Israeli War. That year, in an event known as the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe, over 500 Palestinian villages were ethnically cleansed by Israeli military forces. At least a few dozen of those clearances ended in massacres, and the other 750,000 survivors were either squashed into Gaza and the West Bank, or pushed into refugee camps in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Most of these refugees ended up living just a couple of hours away from their old villages. Many of them still have the keys to their houses and their original land document.
You see, in our debate, when I asked him specifically, should the people who have these documents, the keys to their houses, should they be able to return? He said no. Let's see what he says about this now.
On the year of the Nakba, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution stating that refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be allowed to do so at the earliest practicable date. But despite the resolution being reaffirmed over...
So, I want to note here, he specifically omitted the next part. Very important here, specifically omitting the next part, which is the most important part of this, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, or for loss of damage to property, which under principles of international law, equity should be made good by the government or authorities responsible. Now, do you see what this means specifically, right? The reason why the mention of compensation is there is because that is in lieu of them not wanting, just in case they don't want to return. This is specifically not just them returning to the area, it's returning to the home, to the land, okay? Getting their property back. It is not simply them being allowed to live in Israel. It is them getting what was stolen from them back.
Should be allowed to do so at the earliest practicable date. But despite the resolution being reaffirmed over 100 times, the refugees of 1948 and their descendants have been denied the right of return. Incidentally, this denial is also explicitly listed as one of the inhumane acts in the International Convention on Apartheid. Why is Israel denying this right? Well, broadly speaking, I can think of two reasons. The first, to put it bluntly, is just racism. The current regime in Israel wants to exist as a Jewish ethnic majority with as few Palestinians living there as possible.
Okay, the current regime, not true. Israel has always wanted. Israel has always been about this. That's why they expelled Palestinians from the very beginning. Every mainstream political party in Israel, aside from the Arab parties, or as they call them the Arab parties, they're Palestinian parties, and a lot of them are just collaborators, but they still, on this point, they at least largely agree. Every single mainstream political party in Israel is in favor of the Jewish ethno-state. They use euphemisms a lot, like they will say, for example, even the ones who are against the occupation of the West Bank, who are against settlements, they will use the euphemism in order for Israel to remain Jewish and democratic. What that means is in order for Israel to remain Jewish, we cannot keep annexing parts of the West Bank or parts of whatever other parts where Palestinians live, because there will be more Palestinians in it. And democratic means that if we do that, we will be forced to enforce apartheid, more apartheid upon them, more oppression upon them. It's a euphemism. There is a very interesting thing in Israel, what they call the demographic time bomb problem. It's talked about very openly. It's not hard to find out about, where there is a discussion among parties, left to right. I mean, they call them left, they're obviously not left. They all agree essentially completely on what they call the demographic problem, that it is important to secure the existence of Israel as a Jewish majority state. And the reason for that, ethnic Jewish majority state, and the reason for that is obviously because Israel has always been that way and never hasn't been that way. That's the point of it. That's why they declared independence rather than simply forming or even trying to form one state. It's what it was always about. Let me quote a Meretz politician. Meretz, if you do not know, is held up in Israel as being like particularly left-wing, like a party that people can get behind to support Palestinian liberation. This guy's name is Yair Golan. He was a former fairly high-ranking officer in the IDF, where he served, aka he was a colonial police officer in the occupied territories, as they call them. In reality, all of them are the occupied territories. And he came out being very critical of the Israeli military, very, very critical of the settlements and settlers. But paradoxically, this man who says things like, he constantly says things like the settlers are fucking insane fanatics, murderous morons and stuff like that. He paradoxically makes the ethno-nationalist argument against the settlements. It is his main point against them. is the ethno-nationalist argument. Here's the Times of Israel description of him. A former Israel Defense Forces deputy chief of staff who fought for years in the West Bank, Golan still calls the area by the biblical Judea and Samaria, but he is also a strident critic of the settlement movement and lobbies regularly for the end of the occupation. He does not believe in God, but wants to preserve Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. There's the dog whistle that I talked about, and calls Meretz the Zionist left. And here is a direct quote from him. What's happening on the ground is that we're building towards annexation. The annexation of millions of Palestinians inside of the state of Israel is the end of the Zionist dream. There won't be a Jewish state without a Jewish demographic majority. There you go. This is a supposedly leftist in Israel. It is not the current regime. You know, people like Lonerbox are very happy to denounce Likud, for example, but they will frame it as an issue of like, you know, as in Spanish we call like the government, el gobierno de turno, like the government of the moment, when it's not. It's an issue of Israel. It's an issue of the fundamental nature of the Israeli state, the reason why it was formed. This is fundamentally doing a disservice to the Palestinian cause when you frame it in this way. It's just a very sort of unique problem caused by a particularly radical right-wing moment in time when even the supposed left are largely in agreement with the Jewish ethno-nationalist state project.
Within the country, the events of 1948 have been aggressively whitewashed. Instead of the Nakba, they call it the War of Independence. They have a counter-narrative that either downplays or denies the event, and historians have had to spend decades showing how the Nakba wasn't just an ethnic cleansing, but that it was also calculated and planned in advance. Just this year, a documentary called
It doesn't have to be calculated and planned in advance to be an ethnic cleansing, by the way.
Tantura revived a previously discredited story about a village where over 200 people were shot and buried in a mass grave. Unfortunately, a big part of Israel's refusal to recognize the right of return is because their version of the story denies that any such right exists at all. Now, there is another objection that I think can be taken in good faith. As many Palestinians will even argue, the Nakba never really ended. There were around 750,000 displaced Palestinians in 1948. Today, there are over 7 million. Meanwhile, the populations in Israel and Palestine have also grown quite a bit. Even if you support the right of return in principle, you might stop to ask the practical question, where would they go? Are we going to squeeze 20 million people into a space smaller than Belgium?
Here it is. Here it is. There's no room.
Wouldn't a lot of the Jews currently living in Israel
It
have to
actually
leave?
changes
What if they
the
don't want to?
argument.
Would the solution then be just to have ethnic cleansing but the other way around? To which some people might say, yes, they're colonizers, they're living on stolen land, can yeet them, etc. And the problem with that is that it's effectively just another side of the same coin.
There it is, right? If you give
There's no room? They
Palestinians
can't
back
come there?
their houses that they can prove they own, he literally showed it on the screen, the keys and the deeds, so they can prove, even if they can prove they own them, it's the same thing. Taking back what was stolen from you as part of a concerted ethno-nationalist state-building project is the same thing. It's a different end of the same coin.
It's just another
There's
way
no
of treating
room?
the right of
They
return
can't
as a
come there?
zero-sum game that can only be achieved through an obscene level of violence. And that
There you go. Fundamental objection to anything that inconveniences the colonizer, even in very simple cases where the specific families have the proof this land was stolen from them, that these homes were stolen from them. You still can't do it because violence, right? It seems like anything, even like a far lower level of so-called violence using any sort of physical force or the threat of physical force to achieve a far better and far just goal is off the table for Palestinians. Isn't that interesting? It's just off the table. Doesn't matter if your house was stolen from you, because, you know, if we need to send some police in there to evict the people who are squatting in the house that was stolen from you, I'm sorry, my friend. That's violence and it's not allowed.
just isn't the case. Let's have a look at this map. Those red dots are the 100 or so villages that were depopulated and built over by new settlements. The green dots are the ones that remain standing, but those yellow ones are just under 400 villages that were ethnically cleansed in 1948 and then abandoned. To this day, those areas are still empty. Palestinian scholars and activists have been thinking about
You'll notice how he doesn't acknowledge the fact that many of the people who were forced out during the Nakba, who were ethnically cleansed during the Nakba, they were not from these specific villages or whatever, right? He's trying to frame it as if these towns were the only places that were ethnically cleansed. Everyone else was apparently allowed to stay just fine. That's literally completely 100% wrong. That's just completely fundamentally untrue. You can find buildings, like individual buildings everywhere, all over the so-called state of Israel that you can link to directly to previous Palestinian owners. Like just recently, there was a story, for example, about the Israeli prime minister temporarily living in a house that was appropriated from Palestinians in Jerusalem. We're not just talking about 500 villages. The reason why the villages are talked about is because these were, places that were specifically nearly totally ethnically cleansed, not because they were the only places. He brought up a map that tried to sort of frame it as if, we're not really talking about that much land. This is, just those villages. I don't really want to distinguish things along these terms because I don't believe that anyone who was living in Palestine, whether they were a migrant or not, before the Israeli Declaration of Independence necessarily deserves framed as illegitimate or anything, because the illegitimacy of it is the fact that one side decided and planned to turn it into a massive part of the land into an ethno-state for their exclusive use at the cost of the people who were there before them. Objectively, the vast majority of Palestine was owned and inhabited by either Jews who had the very limited amount of Jews who had lived there for centuries beforehand, around 20,000 before the Zionist movement began, or Palestinians. And he's sort of framing it very differently here, isn't he?
About this question for a very long time. They understand that you can't just unwind history the other way, and thanks to them, with an honorable mention to the UN, the status of just about every refugee since 1948 is extremely well documented. There are records of where they came from, where they are now, and ownership records that show their connection to the land. We know that half of them live within 40 kilometers of their old communities, and that many of them can still see their old homes from the opposite hill. Thanks to the work of scholars like Salman Abu Sita, we even have urban development proposals for integrating refugees into the areas that were built over. We know that even if all 7 million refugees made it back home, the population density would be just a little higher than that of Barbados, and a fraction of that of places like Singapore or Bahrain.
Lonerbrock's now adopting my arguments that I used against him. What did he say before? This is 2 months later. We have a complete 180, a complete change of opinion to adopting literally the exact same arguments that I used against him, the same things that he argued against. Did we use the word density? I don't believe so. Space?
Do you know there's no space in Israel for the entire population of New York Jews to go there? That would be the same problem, right?
No space. There you go. He specifically made the argument that there was no room in Israel. Now he's arguing that, it might be a bit higher than average in terms of density, but there's still room in Israel. Ooh, what changed,
There's
man?
no room? They can't come there?
I wonder what changed. He made the same argument numerous times, by the way. And he tried to argue against it with that hilarious argument, as you heard there, saying that if 2 million Jews from New York cannot be teleported into Israel tomorrow, that means that the right of return should not be allowed.
This is my opinion before that?
Yeah, she did. She said, I think this is my opinion. She said this multiple times. To me, they can't return because then there wouldn't be enough space for Israelis.
Do you think if the entire population of New York Jews, nearly 2 million of them, wanted to go to Israel tomorrow, do you think there would be space for that?
There you go. This is exactly a great example of what I was talking about in the main channel video on the drama TM. Arguing against me, because it's me, he has to take up the opposite position no matter what. Afterwards, he goes back, right, and he has a think about what we were talking about, because he clearly never really thought about it well before. And he realizes that I was correct and he was wrong, and adopts my position as his own, while of course not acknowledging it. He'll never acknowledge that, right? Now, I don't think he really believes in this, right? But you can't make a video, talk about the right of return, and then not talk about this. And his options here are either to take up there's no room, which wouldn't go very well with the Palestinians who he's trying to claim that he represents, or to argue against it. So he's arguing against it. The pure level of opportunism here is off the charts.
And we also have this very cheeky suggestion about how this could all be paid for, especially given that ending the occupation would free a lot of that military aid expenditure.
Did I mention, for example, the Marshall Plan in this? I mentioned it before. I don't know if I did it in this video, but I've suggested before that any sort of one-state solution should come with an internationally supported sort of effort, and that the Marshall Plan, which took place, if you don't know, after World War II, and resulted in the very rapid rebuilding of much of Western Europe in literally 5 years' time, most of the cities that had been bombed into the ground were rebuilt more or less as good or better as they were before. Point in this where he argued against that sort of notion. I might not have mentioned the Marshall Plan specifically, but he asked mockingly, basically impossible. How are you going to do that? You're just going to build lots of houses? See if I can find the search terms. Sorry, I don't want to sift through this entire fucking video just to find what I'm talking about. I don't think we're going to find it. The word house is mentioned too much. Well, you just have to take my word from it, and I'm a streamer, so you know, what the streamer says goes.
Worth noting. I like that. Hey, I had actually just finished editing this video, and then a Jewish member.
You will notice here, he approvingly cites this text that advocates against the physical right of return and for a so-called human right of return, whatever that means, like some sort of vibe, like a land acknowledgement sort of thing, I guess.
Member of my community sent me this article, which I thought was just really, really apt for this section. So I'm just kind of throwing this in after the fact because I'm professional. A lot of people will say that when Israelis reject the right of return, they're really just doing it out of a kind of settler mentality.
Yeah, so here he completely ignores the history of the Zionist movement, which was absolutely a settler colonial mentality. And you especially can't argue that it's not today out of everything. Like the colonial history of the Zionist movement is incredibly well documented. I've been over it so many times, I really have to go over it again just to ensure that it's in this clip. Quote any big Zionist intellectual from the 19th, early 20th century. They say this shit openly. David Ben-Gurion admitted that they had invaded and captured Palestine. I'll find that quote. The first prime minister of Israel, by the way. I've sourced this quote before. It comes from a 1979, I believe, autobiography written by a prominent member of the Zionist movement who heard this in conversation with Ben-Gurion. No reason to doubt that it's an authentic quote. If I were an Arab leader, I would never sign an agreement with Israel. It is normal. We have taken their country. It is true. God promised it to us. But how could that interest them? Our God is not theirs. There have been Nazis, Hitler, anti-Semitism, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They see but one thing. We have come and we have stolen their country. Why would they accept that? If he can acknowledge that, why can't you?
I don't think that's completely untrue, but it definitely doesn't tell the whole story. To show you what I mean by that, I'm just going to read this part out because I think it's...
Now, he's going to essentially use reverse genocide anxiety to sort of, lightly justify this. Of course, afterwards, he's going to say, now, that doesn't justify it. If it doesn't justify it, then why mention it? If it doesn't fundamentally have anything to do with who's in the right or wrong here, what's the point of mentioning it other than to muddy the waters? It's very simple.
Says it better than I could. Why do many Jews fight so hard against the right to return? The fact that many Jews fiercely oppose the Palestinian right to return and the related vision of a peaceful binational state befuddles many activists.
See, here we cannot simply acknowledge that there's massive levels of racism, that the vast majority of the Israeli population are just rank ethno-nationalists. We have to sort of try to find an excuse for it, right? And a rational, understandable excuse that somehow frames them as the victims, which this passage does.
See a shared democracy where both Jews and Palestinians receive respect as one of the most hopeful and just solutions imaginable. But, along with Israel's denials of its responsibility for the refugee crisis, there is a second and deeper issue involved. Jews have had convincing experiences that lacking a place to run can have life or death consequences. So
this goes over how European countries rejected Jewish refugees before World War II, and uses this essentially as a means of explaining, aka borderline justifying, the racism of today's Israelis. And it goes on to say, many fear if Palestinians achieve return inside Israel's 1978 borders, win true demographic rights and grow to be a majority, it might end Jewish control over immigration to Israel. Wow, and? Which many see as that safeguard in case of an anti-Jewish resurgence. It is replacement theory for Israelis. White genocide for Israelis. Reverse genocide for Israelis. The people doing the genocide using their own fear of a genocide to justify continuing the genocide. And then here we go. No matter how frightening a physical implementation of return may sound, Jews must take the fundamental step to acknowledge Palestinians' human right to return. Now, what does that mean? They shouldn't acknowledge their physical right to return, just a human one? A sort of metaphorical, immaterial thing? Not actually like a simple, actual existing material thing, right? We don't have really existing Palestinian homes that were stolen here, not really existing Palestinian land that was stolen here. Just like, we need a human right of return. Maybe not a physical one, because, Jews are frightened by that. I don't know. Who does Jews mean in this? I find the conflation of Jews with Israeli to be a bit problematic here, because I don't think that's particularly accurate. Most Jewish people, in fact, do not live in Israel. But because Israelis have a white, their version of the white replacement theory, which, is really just a post hoc construction to justify what they're doing, not so much a legitimate thing that they actually believe in most of the time. According to Lonerbox, and the person who he is approvingly citing here, we may fear a physical implementation of a right of return for Palestinians, but however, you should nonetheless acknowledge a human right to return, a metaphorical one, an immaterial one, essentially a non-existent one that fundamentally ignores what the right of return actually means. An abstract acknowledgement in the style of the Canadian, Australian, Indigenous land acknowledgement with no actual material justice involved at all in the equation. This is liberal Zionism par excellence. Acknowledge the problem, acknowledge who is in the right and who is in the wrong very clearly, acknowledge the history very clearly, and then treat the perpetrators, treat the oppressors as if they are like innocent little babies who are somehow innocent of this because of their concerns regarding reverse genocide, and try to placate them by being like, well, we're not actually going to materially fix the problem, so don't worry too much about it, We're not going to be giving your stolen land and houses back to the Palestinians. Never fear. But spiritually, vibey, in terms of, good vibes, right? Palestinians are human and they have a human right to return, maybe not a physical one. Approvingly citing this while framing yourself as like representing the Palestinian view is just shameless. Palestinians want a physical right of return. They want a real material right of return. They do not want some metaphorical human spiritual right of return that doesn't actually mean anything in terms of what they're going to get back. What they're going to get back in what was unambiguously taken from them.
1938, 32 nations met in
Hold on, we've already gone over this quote, so we can skip it.
Thing that could have been voiced by the Afrikaners in South Africa, must take the fundamental step to acknowledge Palestinians' human right to return. I think that last line is really essential. The concerns she describes are definitely more understandable than anything that could have been voiced by the Afrikaners in South Africa.
The Afrikaners in South Africa voiced this same concern. They literally did. Actually, we have been oppressed in the past by English. They like to frame themselves as sort of being colonized. They didn't specifically use those terms back then because they weren't quite in vogue. It wasn't the social justice sort of rhetoric that we see today. But they frame themselves as victims of English oppression. And thus, for them, apartheid was sort of a means of self-defense. And they were worried afterwards that the end of apartheid would result in a sort of reverse genocide. The end of white minority rule would result in that sort of thing. These are very similar arguments. And if you're framing one of them as good and the other as bad, I think you might want to think about what you're actually reading.
Isn't even to mention the very real issue of anti-Semitism in the Middle East that existed long before the State of Israel was formed and still persists today in the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah.
This is absolutely and just wrong. It's completely wrong. Of course, anti-Semitism did exist before the establishment of Israel, before any talk of Israel even existed in the Middle East. But the Middle East was factually far less bad in terms of anti-Semitism than Western Europe was, and all of Europe was. Russia was terrible too. That's why whenever Jews were expelled from places like Spain, Portugal, etc., they went south, they went to North Africa and the Middle East. Now, this obviously doesn't mean that these places were great places for Jews, but it does mean that it was better. Now, what happened is that Israel's founding factually, objectively, resulted in a relative explosion of anti-Semitism. In fact, Arab countries, Arab governments, and a lot of our Middle Eastern people adopted European anti-style anti-Semitism. The reason why you see Iran, for example, government figures holding Holocaust denial conferences, talking about shit like the protocols of the Elders of Zion, is because after the establishment of Israel, after Palestine was usurped, they sort of went looking for ways to attack it, ways to attack Israel, and they found a long-standing tradition of European anti-Semitism that now a lot of them have essentially just adopted for themselves. Israel absolutely has fueled this sort of worsening of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. It is factually true that most of that is a reaction to Israel. Now, that doesn't justify it, obviously, but it is literally a reaction to Israel. And I want to note, too, you will note that Lonerbox takes special care to denounce the only groups, as terrible as they may be, who are actually taking up arms against the Israeli state, specifically Hamas and Hezbollah, the two most significant ones. He goes to pains to denounce them. The main reason why Israel, the USA, Europe, etc., hate Hamas and Hezbollah isn't that they are anti-Semitic. And in many ways, they factually are. The main reason they hate them is because these groups fight back. They're not Fatah. They haven't essentially turned themselves into a colonial police force, into a puppet government of Israel. They're not specifically under control of Israel. They fight back with weapons, as whatever little weapons they have, and that is why they need to be attacked. That is the primary reason they need to be attacked. Now, I want to juxtapose here. Lohnerbock said that Israeli reverse genocide fears of reverse genocide are good and valid. However, Arab Middle Eastern anti-Semitism, now that has nothing to do with the establishment of Israel. It is true that after World War II, Jews obviously had many reasons to believe that they might be better off alone. That is not even remotely worth mentioning in the context of them invading and conquering Palestine and excluding Palestinians from their own country. And it is also true, for example, that the establishment of Israel bred massive outbursts of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. And that obviously doesn't justify that anti-Semitism either. However, Lohnerbox can only say that for one. Lohnerbox has to lie and downplay the effect that Israel has had on anti-Semitism in the Middle East. So Jewish people, according to him, had a completely rational reaction to the Holocaust that led them to unfortunately do a bad thing, while Arab and other Middle Eastern people, because Iranians are not Arabs, they are, however, unambiguously in the wrong for that, and there is no material factor that can explain it away like there is for Israeli settler colonialism just being them trying to be safe, which is not true, as I went over beforehand. Interesting juxtaposition there, and you can really see where his sympathies lie.
But I would also argue that groups like this do, at least partially, owe their success to decades of Israeli aggression, and to some dubious divide and conquer tactics by a certain Israeli governor. The fear of anti-Semitism should never be swept under the rug, but it also can't serve as a reason to justify an eternal cycle of human rights violations. The idea of continuing to
just human rights violations.
oppress innocent people today on the basis that they might end up oppressing us tomorrow is not an ethical position we would take anywhere else, and it shouldn't be taken here either.
Yet you nonetheless just approvingly cited a passage that very much takes up that position to explain away and excuse Israeli feelings on why they need to oppress Palestinians. He kind of tries to frame it like he was arguing against it, when only at the very last line and only after clarifying that non-Jewish Middle Easterners, non-Israeli Middle Easterners are to blame for their anti-Semitism, while Israelis are not to blame for their replacement theory. So, just a very interesting juxtaposition. Like, how do you rationalize those two positions? Like, if you're gonna go with the first one, which, you know, as untrue as it is for Zionism as a whole, before World War II especially, how can you mention that and then state afterwards that the establishment of Israel and Israel's abhorrent treatment of Palestinians, abhorrent colonization, abhorrent conquest of Palestine has not bred anti-Semitism as a result of Israel claiming to be the representative of the Jewish people, claiming to be the Jewish state, etc., etc.? How can you not acknowledge that? He talks about it as if it would have happened anyway. I'll tell you right now, if Palestine had been colonized by Mormons, we would not have an anti-Semitism problem anywhere near as pronounced in the Middle East as we do today. We would have an anti-Mormonism problem. You need to understand this not as some sort of immaterial idea where Middle Easterners are just like sort of innately anti-Semitic. You need to understand it as the consequences of what has happened, what has materially happened. And this is the issue with the framing of Israel-Palestine. People don't treat it in this way. They don't treat it like it's applicable. Like it's easily, these things are interchangeable, because they are. Change Israeli to American settler, change Palestinian to Native American, completely applicable. Imagine if the English had done settler colonialism in Palestine. Who would people in the Middle East hate? Would it be Jewish people or would it be English people? I guarantee you they would be hatching conspiracy theories regarding the Anglo-Saxon control of the world rather than the Jewish control of the world. This is very material. It's really that simple. It's people looking at the country, Israel, looking at what it claims to be, looking at who Israelis claim to be, looking at who they claim to be doing the atrocities, what that they do in the name of, and being like, oh, They claim to be Jewish. They claim to be representative of Jewish people. So we're going to find, roundabout conspirational ways to delegitimize this group of people. What he frames in that last segment as nothing more than like historical anti-Semitism that has nothing to do with the establishment of Israel is not that at all. It has everything to do with that. It's just the juxtaposition between how he's willing to come up with a roundabout excuse for Israelis, who in this arrangement are the oppressors, but for Hamas, which are a Palestinian resistance group, in a Palestinian armed resistance group, regardless of how much you don't like them, it is a fact that they are a resistance group, and Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese resistance group, because Lebanon is also a victim of Israeli military aggression, don't forget. He wants to delegitimize them. However, the Israelis need to have excuses made for how they feel. Their feelings are valid. Their feelings might not be valid justifications unless we need to acknowledge them. We need to coddle them. And we need to acknowledge why they are against the physical right of return and coddle them by only advocating for the human right of return. And he never actually gave us his stance on the right of return here, by the way. He didn't actually address it. And the reason for that, the reason why he kind of skirted around it is because, as he has stated before, he is against the right of return. Now, the right of return means Palestinians returning to their land and homes that they can reasonably prove were theirs before they were stolen by a concerted ethnic cleansing effort backed by the Israeli state. When we asked him this question...
Were you listening? I've said that like 8 times now.
That like Israelis living in stolen houses shouldn't be evicted.
Yeah, I don't... Well, like en masse or like... No, I don't think people should be evicted, no.
Well, I think if Palestinians can prove...
I don't think you're going to get into Israel and evict them without violence. Yeah.
We're not... Yeah, like, there it is. Because there would be violence, right? A roundabout justification. You can never... It's wrong for there to be used for any sort of physical force to be used to establish justice for colonized people. For some reason, he straight up said to the question, Palestinians engaging in the right of return, returning to their homes, fundamentally means some Israelis will need to leave wherever they are, will need to be evicted from wherever they are, because Palestinians are the rightful owners of that land if they can reasonably prove it was theirs, with the deeds or whatever. The land or the house, if it's still there, those sorts of things. When asked on that question, and that is what the right of return means to Palestinians, Lonerbach said no. I just showed you. In his video, Lonerbach said that what he thought was what important is what Palestinians want. What Palestinians want regarding the right of return, I went over that in my video on the matter, and I will shortly bring up the source for this. This is the amount of Palestinians who would accept compensation because it is unlikely for refugees to return back to their hometowns. In no group does it go above 23%, and in no group does it go below 67%. So if we're talking about what Palestinians want, as Lonerbach framed it dishonestly that he was doing in this video, as you can see here, he frames himself as sort of speaking for Palestinians, caring about what they want, and clearly on this matter he doesn't care very much because they don't want what he's sort of advocating for here, what he very specifically has advocated against multiple times. In this case, they absolutely are a monolith. Very few Palestinians would accept anything short of getting their land and their homes returned. So, are you on their side or are you not? It's a very simple question. If you're not for the right of return. Ergo, Lonerbach is against the right of return. When given an analogy on the matter regarding Nazi settlements in Poland in World War II, he reiterated this point. The Nazis win World War II. Their settlers have babies who take over their houses. Are the houses now theirs?
I would say that you get to a point where time passes and you get to a point where reversing history isn't...
There you go. That was his response. He argued specifically that in a hypothetical scenario where the Nazis won World War II and solidified their control over, say, colonized Poland, it would essentially have been wrong for Polish people to advocate for their right of return, for the right to get their homes and land back, because, past a certain amount of time, it's just not actionable, right? As he said, it clearly is actionable, especially in the Palestinian case, when so many people have such well-documented proof of where they were from, where their houses are, but he's still against it. He was against it in the Palestinian context. He was even against it in the Nazi context. So I find it very, very interesting that during his segment on the right of return, he really didn't actually talk about whether he is for Palestinians returning to their own houses or not, because he's against that, as he stated very clearly twice in his debate with me. So he first frames himself as being on the side of the Palestinians, framing it as what's important is what they want. Then doesn't actually advocate for that, for what they want in terms of the right of return, while sort of framing it as if he was. And now he gets to BDS. Now, BDS, by the way, is just a single organization, which he scoffed at. I want you to remember going into this part of the video that when he mentioned BDS once, it was only in the context of literally scoffing at the idea. If you didn't believe already that he was adopting a position in the moment just to argue against someone that his clout network dictates that you need to argue against, this video that he made here where he adopts most of the positions that he argued against, or a lot of the positions at least that he argued against in this video, aside from the right of return, obviously, you will see just how dishonest he is, and it's really incontestable. Doing things to change.
Well,
the
I used to
positions
do
of our
activism for.
governments.
Yeah. Oh, so what? You want to BDS Israel out of existence? Is that where we're at now?
It worked in South Africa. Why wouldn't it work here?
South Africa didn't abolish itself as a.
And then he goes into like these semantics. It didn't literally change its name and abolish itself. It just completely changed everything about itself. So you see right there, he essentially scoffed at the idea of like a boycott, sanction, etc. movement of the sort that worked amazingly in South Africa to end white minority rule. And, you know, that would essentially be a very similar thing to ending the sole Jewish or Jewish-Israeli rule over all of Palestine. And
So
now he goes
those are
into
two demands, and
BDS.
hopefully I've given you a good idea of how to responsibly defend them. The next question is,
He didn't even defend the right of return, didn't even really honestly frame what it actually is, which is the return of specific land and homes to the Palestinians who they were stolen from.
what do? The first and most obvious thing is something called BDS, standing for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. This is largely based on the strategies of the anti-apartheid movement, which
I really hate this because BDS is the name of a specific organization. It's not a term to refer to like a broader movement, because BDS is very problematic in and of itself. BDS, for example, has made tons of concessions to Israel. It's like, we acknowledge Israel's existence. You should only boycott products from the West Bank, the so-called occupied territories, etc., not from like Israel as a whole. They're very wishy-washy. They're very liberal in that respect. They're not really that committed as an organization to a South Africa level boycott and sanction regime at all. They are very specific and targeted sorts of things, which is not what we need. You should not use the slogan BDS. Rather, you should simply talk about a broad, boycott sanction movement. Boycott really doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if we boycott. What matters is sanctions. What matters is states, cutting commercial material relations with Israel and sanctioning it, etc., etc. Now, normally we should be against sanctions, but in this case, it's like South Africa. South Africa, black South Africans, white South Africans as well, who are also part of the anti-white majority rule argument. Those people, they knew that if any, sanctions would affect them more than it would the population who were oppressing them. Yet they still wanted them because it was the best way to get them to give up. This is the same case in Israel as well. Palestinians would be affected massively by sanctions and cutting of commercial ties, etc., etc., with Israel. They would be affected far more than Israelis would, because they are colonized by Israel. They are essentially an incredibly marginalized part of the wider Israeli economy. Gaza, for example, is under a blockade by Israel, They would be affected more than this, yet they still want it because they are willing to take this suffering for a greater goal. And you will see tons of polls. If you ask Palestinians about this sort of sanction regime, they overwhelmingly support it. This is what separates, for example, sanctions on Israel from, for example, sanctions on Venezuela. Venezuelans do not want to be sanctioned. Palestinians, the oppressed population, who are essentially a part of one oppressive Israeli state at this point, absolutely, they're willing to take the hit here. And that's why we should support a sanction movement. It's also probably the best way to get it done. It will take a while, but Israel is a westernized consumer population. Make it so they can't get their iPhones, they'll cave in a week. It really is that simple, despite how much people think it is. The difficult part of it is convincing some of their important allies to do so, though we're certainly making progress in recent times because even like liberal countries that are allied to Israel have been getting slightly iffy with the things that they do, have been saying negative things about them more and more often, even as inadequate and shitty as they are. So we pressure them for years and years and years, hoping they will cave. That is the only way to do this. No individual boycott, not by changing the brand of hummus that you buy, through a concerted movement, putting pressure on our governments, forcing them to do to Israel what we forced them to do to South Africa 40, 30 years ago.
involved boycotts of consumer products, sports teams refusing to compete, academic boycotts by universities, and eventually economic sanctions from governments. Campaigns like this have already been shown to have an effect in Israel, particularly in the settlements. In 2014, an official in the Jordan Valley admitted that their income had been severely damaged, mostly because supermarkets in Western Europe were refusing to sell their produce.
That is because, as I said, they target the settlements specifically. They don't target Israel as a whole, solely products from the settlements. It's not just the settlements that are the problem. It's not just the so-called occupied territories that are the problem. It's all of Israel, okay? And the only way to get them to dismantle their regime of ethnic supremacism and to even come to the fucking, the negotiating table regarding the right of return for Palestinians regarding a one-state solution is to do far more than just not buy olives from a settlement, okay?
If you want a couple of familiar examples, Sabra Hummus produced in
He's literally telling you not to buy hummus. He's literally telling you not to buy hummus.
Israel is part of a joint venture with the Strauss Group, which gives aid to the Golani Brigade of the Israeli military, and HP, the computers, not the condiments, have had a history of providing data security services.
He's telling you specific products which you shouldn't buy. It's individual neoliberal consumer activism. I cannot fucking believe it.
For the Israeli administration of border
Are you
crossings.
kidding me?
This means they've had a direct hand in upholding the checkpoint system, which severely limits Palestinian movement. It's useful to have this kind of information because when you're an activist, you're very likely to come across opposition. If you want to join a student organization to push an academic boycott, but you go to a university that's full of conservatives, like I did, then it might be worth looking into exactly which institutions your university is tied to. For example, it's much harder to argue for a boycott of the Multicultural University of Haifa than it is to target somewhere like Bar Ilan, which works directly with the
Oh, you shouldn't boycott the nice Israeli universities because they're multicultural, whatever the fuck that means. But you should target the bad Israeli universities. Whew! My man is not very committed at all to the Palestinian cause.
IDF to develop unmanned combat vehicles. Depending on where you are, it does help to be realistic, and knowing these kind of details can be incredibly valuable. Now, unfortunately, in the US, where this activism would be the most effective, many states are introducing anti-BDS legislation. Whether or not that's even constitutional, I doubt anyone could reasonably say that Americans shouldn't have the ability to boycott regimes. This is where Palestine Legal comes in. It's a non-profit that offers legal advice to Palestinian advocacy groups, as well as challenging anti-BDS legislation. If you were interested in donating to an organization, I would definitely recommend this one. At the moment, they're involved in a lawsuit against...
Apparently, we just need NGOs filing lawsuits against state governments in the US. We need to buy different brands of hummus and not buy HP computers. Anyone buy HP computers anymore? Not sure. But fundamentally here, he is advocating for an incredibly neutered and vastly ineffective version of what he scoffed at in my discussion with him.
Yeah, oh, so what, you want to BDS Israel out of existence? Is that where we're at now?
It worked in South Africa. Why wouldn't it work here? You see that? He specifically uses South Africa as the illustrative example. And in his video, advocates for what he calls BDS, a very neutered presentation of it, but nonetheless, it's the same sort of idea that he scoffed at here. I specifically use South Africa as my example of the same sort of thing working. He argued against that. He argued it was impossible. He argued that it would essentially be impossible because they have nukes, blah, blah, blah. And now here he is making the same, not this exact same argument, because he argues for a much more neutered version of a sanctions regime against Israel, specifically targeting, you don't want to target the multicultural Haifa University, but nonetheless, what he scoffed at when talking to me, he is now arguing for, or at least a more neutered version of it. And he did this obviously before in the video as we went over with the there's no space argument. He changed completely. He right here is providing probably the best example of the clout network that these people operate in and how they change their own beliefs on the fly depending on who they're speaking to, whose side they need to be taking in the moment. So now the things that he framed as like practically insane while speaking to me, he's specifically arguing for, using the exact same arguments that I used against him, that he argued against. I have not seen a more dishonest person in a very long time, to be honest. He's happy with it as long as I'm not saying it, essentially. Especially the space argument, like, that one was just terrible.
Texas, where legislators are denying state contracts to companies that support BDS, which is bad, so link in the description. Another thing you can do, especially if you don't have the time to get involved in local action, is to f***ing vote, you idiot. Now, don't
vote for Joe Biden, vote for Keir Starmer. He's obviously going to couch this behind, I mean, I know he does, I've watched it, but he's obviously going to couch this behind, don't hit me. I know they're libs, I know they're bad, but still they're better than the other guy. You still got to vote for him. This is going to make a difference. His prescriptions here are buy different brands of hummus. Here's the brand of hummus that you should avoid, by the way. Vote for Joe Biden. It's unfucking real, man. From a guy who mocked me for claiming that my prescriptions were basically unactionable and impossible. He has since adopted the same prescriptions, and he's making the absolute least effective possible arguments for how to implement them. Vote for Joe Biden, vote for Keir Starmer, try to, make Joe Biden good, boycott hummus, just like a BDS as a slogan rather than a real fundamentally well-organized campaign to force your government to concede on the issue.
Don't worry, this is not an endorsement of Joe Biden or, God forbid, Keir Starmer.
It's also interesting to me how they always say, I don't endorse Joe Biden, but when it comes down to it, they always fundamentally argue for nonetheless backing them to defending them. It always fundamentally comes down to some form of defense for them. It's like, yeah, they're bad. I hate them, but we gotta vote for them forever, always.
I would never. For one, Biden's approach to Israel and Palestine has been fairly underwhelming. His administration has been uniquely quiet on the issue, and he seems to have avoided making any detailed prescriptions. However, I would still...
You will notice the language used here, fairly underwhelming, not abhorrent, not disgusting, fairly underwhelming. We cannot actually denounce Joe Biden. We can be disappointed in him, but we cannot denounce him.
Still argue that Biden would not have gone as far as his predecessor, who overturned decades of US policy by recognizing the right of Israel to annex parts of the West Bank. This proposal, which was drawn up in Trump's Israeli-Palestinian peace plan, was opposed by most Democrat leaders before it was frozen in 2020.
So the Democratic Party supports the pre-Trump status quo, therefore they are better and we all need to get out and vote for them. This is literally his prescriptions of vote and buy less hummus. I cannot
Recent
believe
developments,
it.
there is still a worrying chance that a Likud majority in Israel and a Republican presidency in 2024 could lead to this plan being implemented. I don't want to...
Look, what this sort of prescription here, whether he means it or not, is enabling liberal Zionism, because the liberal Zionist argument is simply retreat from the settlements in order to protect the two-state solution where Palestinians can be confined to a much reduced Palestinian state and to keep Israel as a Jewish ethno-state, which Palestinians are opposed to because they want their homes and land back.
Go off on a tangent about that, but suffice to say it will be very bad. For all Biden's flaws, Trump was a special case when it came to Israel, even by US standards. People like Biden and Starmer may have weak positions on Israel and Palestine, but that doesn't mean they have to. Just this year, possibly for the first time ever, Democrats and Dem-leading independents were shown to have more favorable views towards the Palestinian people.
You will notice that this is what I argued for. This is what I argued for in our discussion. I said, over a long time period, we pressure Western governments, the most powerful, economically powerful governments in the world, not just Western governments either. Countries like China as well can have a massive effect. And we pressure them to, boycott Israel, blah, 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 sanction Israel, blah, 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 as they did to South Africa, force the consumer population of Israel to have some sort of material effects on their lives, like no more iPhone, and they'll cave in a week. That's a fact. And now he's essentially advocating for the same thing that he previously scoffed at.
And government than they had towards Israelis. When you see that development contrasted with...
But saying this and then saying just vote, it's not the same thing, right? Voting for Joe Biden is not this. Voting for Joe Biden is not pressuring the US government to eventually, maybe 10 years down the line, finally cave and sanction Israel after every other country has already done it, just as they did with South Africa.
The other side, where a third of the increasingly vocal American evangelicals think the entire country...
And regardless, even if the US specifically or some other big country specifically doesn't go along with it, the US didn't go along with the boycott of South Africa either, until the very end, until it already didn't matter. And the pressure on them was still so fucking much. So even though the US is economically very powerful, we don't specifically need them. We can eliminate specific problematic countries that don't want to budge by simply making the consensus among other countries so powerful and so widespread that the effects are visible regardless.
Country should belong to a single Israeli government. It does take an exceptional amount of privilege not to spot the difference between these two sides. As for our...
It does take an exceptional amount of privilege. They always say that. You have to be so fucking privileged. You have to be so fucking privileged if you don't want to vote for Joe Biden.
Brick-shaped talking head in the UK, his views are already standing at odds with his party members who have been much more vocal against Israel than he has. Of course, the best way to convince politicians to change their tune is to...
When he talks about party members here, he's talking about the Corbyn wing of the party, which is completely marginalized now. You cannot frame Labour as a whole as being pro-Palestine anymore at all. That part of the party has been excised, specifically by the false anti-Semitism allegation campaign that he said in our debate was a real thing.
They're guilty by association, right?
You're trying... Oh my God, you would be fucking awesome in the Blairite wing of the Labour Party, dude. You've got it down pat.
Yeah,
Just
because some people,
straight up.
unfortunately, some people on the very far left are pretty anti-Semitic. Yeah.
Oh my
I
God,
don't know if you
are
realize it, but it's coming
you
through
are
pretty fucking hard.
you fucking my man. Keir Starmer needs you on his PR team. It's absurd the way that he's framing this. He's against the people in the Labour Party who were completely destroyed in terms of their power within the party by a smear campaign that he said to my face was real and heckin' valid. And now he has the gall to be like, oh, you know, Keir Starmer may be the leader, but he's not representative of the broader party. Yeah, he is. Okay.
In 1986, Ronald Reagan infamously tried to veto a set of sanctions against South Africa, but was ultimately overridden by an overwhelming vote in the Senate. The public pressure against the apartheid regime was so strong that even a good number of Republicans didn't want to take on the burden of supporting a pariah state.
As I said, that happened so late. The US was so late.
Knows, maybe with enough persuasion, even this guy could make.
He's going to play the video of Biden making a speech against apartheid, but that's not going to happen. Biden has explicitly said that he's a Zionist, okay? And acknowledging apartheid, as I said, in Israel doesn't get to the roots of the problem. It's really not controversial anymore. It's just not an accurate framing for the issue. I've gone over this for the entire video. I always restate myself too much because we always get to points where all I need to do is restate myself because these sorts of people just don't make good arguments.
Become part of South Africa's problem. We must remain part of their solution. We must not aim to impose ourselves, our solutions, our favorites in South Africa. Damn it, we have favorites in South Africa. The favorites in South Africa are the people who are being repressed by that ugly white regime. We have favorites. Our loyalty is not to South Africa, it's to South Africans.
Can you imagine Lonerbox saying anything like this regarding Palestine? Because I cannot. He has a very strong tendency to make excuses for Israelis, to sort of make it out like blaming Israelis for anything is wrong and only blaming the so-called regime is right, as if the so-called regime does not involve Israelis, as if the state of Israel is not by and for Israelis. So it's like a very depersonalized, desystemicized understanding of what happens where the only responsibility is on an ephemeral object called the state that apparently does everything without any sort of complicity of anyone else.
South Africans are majority black, and they are being excoriated. It is not to some stupid puppet government over there. It is not to the Afrikaner regime. We have no loyalty to them. We have no loyalty to South Africa, to South Africans. And the fact of the matter is I listen to this rationale first of all. It is the leaders of South Africa and their people, black and white, who have the majority responsibility. They must rise to it. Well, they are rising to it. They're rising to it. The only thing left available to do with that repulsive, repugnant regime of Afrikaners there. And it's the only way they have. They tried.
It's, by the way, very inaccurate that he frames it as Afrikaners. He should have said white. I'm pretty sure it's because you can't say white in US politics. It's an illegal racist term to say because it wasn't simply Afrikaners. In fact, Afrikaners were numbered by British descendants who spoke English, who also were just as in favor as them of the apartheid regime.
Everything for the last 20 years. They begged, they borrowed, they crawled, and now they're taking up arms.
I think a good thing to remember here is that politicians are...
You see, Biden justifies South African armed resistance. Even Mr. Joe Biden from the olden days justifies it. Lonerbox tries his very hardest to delegitimize any groups that are fighting the Israeli state with arms.
Not leaders. A lot of them will just happily go in whatever direction they think the public is going. Whether or not they do that on our side of the world is really up to us. It's one thing to know that an unprecedented number of people are favoring Palestinians in their answers to survey questions. The next step is to demonstrate that. There's a famous quote that gets passed around online, which may or may not be authentic, but it does seem to capture the intent of the Israeli regime just after 1948. It simply goes, "The old will die and the young will forget." Clearly, the young have not forgotten. Not over there or over here. And
wow, so
I think that's an encouraging thought.
His actual prescriptions, when you get down to it, vote for Joe Biden and Keir Starmer. Like these sorts of people, they are absolutely in unison on that. I don't like these guys, but we gotta always vote for them. We gotta support them no matter what, no matter how much you dislike them. Stop buying certain brands of hummus. BDS, which he scoffed at previously, essentially trying to make the same exact prescription that I myself made when we spoke and that he was unequivocally against. And as far as the right of return went, he didn't actually say anything about it, aside from agreeing with a liberal Zionist passage that was specifically advocating for some sort of ephemeral, unreal, not material human right of return rather than a physical one. He also made the argument that there is enough room for Palestinians in Palestine after previously having argued against it when speaking to me. So when we get down to his stances here are Israeli concerns about reverse genocide are heckin' valid. The right of return, maybe they can sort of return, but only to 500 specific towns, and not in any case where an Israeli might be inconvenienced or we have to use violence. Palestinian resistance, armed resistance is all bad and reprehensible. Any sort of use of violence should be opposed. we should not buy certain brands of hummus and HP laptops. You should not boycott the nice Israeli universities. You should only boycott the bad ones. Vote for Joe Biden and Keir Starmer. That's really about it. Half of that he argued against when we spoke, and the rest of it is just like so nothing that it took him a lot of effort to try and frame it as something. Very, very interesting. I mean, it's not interesting at all. This is pretty much what you would have expected from the guy. What you would have expected from most of these people. This is liberal Zionism par excellence. The problems are bad, but the solutions are bad also, and we shouldn't go too far. He argued that there's no room for Palestinians to return to their homes because 2 million Jews couldn't teleport there immediately. He essentially adopted a lot of my arguments here after previously having argued against them. As I said, just what a fantastic example of how people like this are here to make money, to gain clout, not so much to actually have consistent politics, to advocate for anything, any sort of I wouldn't call them real like political subjects in any way. They are politically themed brands. Yeah, politically themed brands who are total opportunists, who try to appeal to the widest possible demographic that they think they can, while still trying to maintain their self-branding as a sort of radical. And this is what this guy is. Many of us are. I'm not just talking solely about him. This, combined with our previous discussion and the juxtaposition between the stances that he adopts directly from me in this video, that he clearly had never thought of before previously, but had argued against in the moment because of who was saying them. And, you know, what he says here, it's very obvious. And I thank him for making this video and providing us with a fantastic example of everything that I've been saying about him, about the streamer community in general, about liberal Zionism in general, and providing me with an excellent opportunity to explain its flaws and explain the problems with the clout networks and the opportunist faux leftist networks that he and others like him operate in, that fundamentally serve to advocate against the interests of Palestinians and against the way that Palestinians advocate for their own liberation, along with many other issues outside of the issue of Israel-Palestine, because this is not just about this at all. It's about the way these people operate in general. They operate from they stick to a very safe standpoint. That's why they will always in the end come down to vote for Starmer, vote for Biden. You know, they might be bad, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to suggest any sort of action that might reasonably challenge that in the long term, like forming a different party or whatever. Like, this is his only video, by the way, that has actually involved any sort of real research. And the research was done by someone else for the apartheid section. And then he came on just to like put a bunch of headlines on the screen while stating his own opinions. The rest of his content, like, it's Jordan Peterson is bad in 2022. Hassan is bad. This is obviously a means of him to sort of conform with the ultimately pro-US foreign policy line of the Vorshite sphere, these sorts of faux left people who sort of are really insistent on supporting US imperialism, but want to frame it as in this case, as a special exception. That means you need to accept it without getting into the fact that accepting it ever is probably a bad idea. What that means for its broader legitimization. Russell Brand bad, Ukraine. Well, that one's fair. Russell Brand's a fucking moron. But still, it's very easy to debunk Russell Brand. There's no substance here at all. British transphobes are bad. We all know this. This is all stuff that is going to appeal as much to centrists as it is to, you know, anyone who are on the left. It's very safe sort of stuff. British transphobes are bad. Joe Rogan's a fucking idiot. Lauren Southern is bad. Nick Fuentes is bad. He made a pro-debate video. Of course he did. Has to suck up to Vorsh. A reasoned intellectual response to Vorsh, because, you know, as I said in my video on the matter, perfect examples, you have to pretend that Vorsh is a smart person in order to get clout from him. As a good faith, you have to pretend to be a good faith critic. I used to be a Nazi. I was radicalized. I was in the alt-right. As always, Winston Churchill is bad, but not that bad, of course. Sigma males. Jordan Peterson, a poem. No, I'm not watching that. I would die of cringe. Ben Shapiro is bad. Racism is bad. MAGA is bad. Count Dankula is bad. These are all things that anyone can agree with. Topics that are very easy to cover, that you don't need to really think that much about to cover too. Because we all know about these people. We all know why they're bad, or at least we've heard their talking words a million times before, and we know how to explain that they're bad. We know that they're bad. We don't really need to explain it anymore. It's very simple sort of stuff, very surface level, non-systemic sort of stuff that anyone could make. If I made this sort of content, I could shit out like 4 videos a month. And when he finally does tackle a topic that you at least need to put a little bit of thought into, the majority of it is actually made by someone else. And his portion is just, honestly, I really hope he didn't spend more than a day or 2 on it, because it was just so nothing. You will never find people like this covering, for one, non-sort of mainstream topics that are actually very difficult to get into from a very sort of systemic material perspective. You will solely get them covering easy topics that will get them a lot of clout from a wide-ranging audience. And he knows that, so if he sees this, he's probably not going to acknowledge it. That will cut him very, very deep, because I know as a fact that he is someone who said that they liked my videos until I objected to his own wishy-washy liberal stances on Israel-Palestine and his association with ethno-nationalists. So as much as he will not admit that fact, I know that he was like that, I know that he said that about me, and I know that this hurts him. And good. I'm glad. I'm glad that I'm able to cut down to his very essence and the essence of many people like him.